Our next topic related to collective action is the idea of a social movement. And what a social movement is a much broader group of people participating together and not necessarily coming together in any sort of real organized or institutionalized form. These are much less organized, and they're sort of large waves of people that spring up at a certain time, push for something, and then often just sort of dissipate or dissolve after they achieve their goals or after the movement fails. And so to think about what a social movement is, you can start with thinking about all of these sort of pushes for democracy, mass protests, for example, and authoritarian regimes meant to bring about more democratic governance. These are social movements. And so here we've got an example of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. These are, of course, were huge protests back in 2004 to bring about a more democratic government in Ukraine. And of course, in Ukraine, we also had huge protests in 2014 in the Maidan. Here is the Berlin Wall falling, right? And of course, in 1989 to 1991, lots of autocratic or authoritarian states in the Warsaw Pact saw huge social movements push the dictators out of office and replace them, sometimes with other dictators, which is a pretty common thing to happen after one dictator gets pushed out, but sometimes with democratizing governments. And indeed, the idea of people power, this is a broad idea that people have the power, popular sovereignty. It also specifically references movements for democracy. In particular, there was a movement for democracy in the Philippines that was labeled the people power movement, but we see this all over the place. And so these pushes for huge social change are social movements where you have thousands or even tens of thousands of people working together to try and change the political regime. You can also think of the American, Tea Party here as a social movement. Lots of people getting together to achieve something, and they are often, like the Tea Party, really concerned with what's fair, with trying to right some wrong or some injustice in society. And these often do come about because of some injustice. So here, the Tea Party, the injustice, of course, was the idea of the British government taxing things on the colonies so much, and they were rebelling against that. Of course, in the modern day, we can talk about the Occupy Wall Street movement as a social movement that that kind of sprung up in the wake of the financial crisis and was really trying to right the wrong of a sense of global elite or the 1% being able to take advantage of everything and throw everybody else in society under the bus. Very similarly, we have the modern American Tea Party movement or the Tea Party Patriots, and they are also a social movement trying to stand up for what they see is the injustice of sort of government overreach and misuse of taxpayer money. And so going back to some of the thinking we've done with political behavior and different forms of morality, I would say both of these groups are really concerned with fairness, and they just have very different perceptions of what the fairness or unfairness in society looks like. Social movements are also really important for understanding people standing up for their rights and indeed expanding rights. And so the examples here of the suffragette movement, of a social movement focused upon extending the right to vote to women, or here also the March on Washington, the civil rights movement, the idea of ending discrimination, ending disenfranchisement for minorities, particularly Black people, particularly in the South, right? Ending the Jim Crow system. And so these broad social movements are also often about trying to stand up for rights, to try and force policy change. And so they're similar to interest groups in a lot of ways because they're focused on policy change, but they are much more loosely organized. So these are large groups of people, and here you can see Tahrir Square in Cairo, the capital of Egypt. This is back in the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings. Huge social movements across that whole region, and they were really concerned with trying to right a lot of the injustices of their corrupt autocratic leaderships. And indeed, this is a central sort of strand in the study of social movements. It seems like social movements often come about when there's some sort of enormous and grave injustice in society. The author of your text, Shively, he calls this a response to contentious politics. So there's some sort of conflict or contentiousness when it comes to the evolution and origins of social movements. But we can think of this in all sorts of ways. These are sort of often reactions to some awful incident. And indeed, here we have, again, Tahrir Square during the Arab Springs. The Arab Spring. The Arab Spring really starts in Tunisia when a single person is so fed up with the corruption and rot of his government that when a police officer shakes him down and steals his money, he was so fed up he set himself on fire. This is called self-immolation. And that act of self-immolation really just sparked the entire region to protest, because they were saying, yes, I see the same injustice in my life every day. And this, of course, spread across the entire region. And it's those sorts of injustice. And when we talk about the Tea Party or the Occupy Wall Street movements, they're reacting to sort of grave injustices in the economy or the state. You could talk about Black Lives Matter, reacting to injustices. And so these social movements often and almost always are really responding to some outrage, some egregious act of wrongdoing, and often, something immoral or unjust has happened in society and they spring up. However, they're much more loosely organized than interest groups, and so they don't necessarily have leadership or paid staff or even a defined set of goals or principles that motivate them. They can be very loose, not just in terms of organization, but in terms of sort of the reason what they want. So they might all be really angry about the injustices of an autocratic regime, but exactly, how to go about solving those injustices, that is something that usually social movements have a hard time articulating. And indeed, when we think about whether it's the Arab Spring or the Black Lives Matter or Occupy or Tea Party movements in the United States, a lot of the time they don't have super clearly defined goals. And that's a pretty typical element of social movements. And again, that's because they often arise pretty spontaneously, pretty quickly, in a response to some egregious, outrageous thing that's happened. So they are pursuing some form, some purpose, but again, that purpose can often be sort of difficult to hone in on. They can have different elements of the social movements advocating for different things. They're also very closely related to the concept of civil society, which is that realm sort of in between the state or the actual institutions and organizations of the state and our own individual sort of personal and family lives, in our homes behind closed doors. Civil society is everything sort of in between that. All of the civic associations, be it church memberships, book groups, bowling leagues, whatever it is. And having a vibrant civil society often makes social movements even more likely, because these are the networks of people that when something happens, they have each other's phone numbers and email addresses, and they get in touch with one another and say, you know what, I'm going to the main square to protest this. And so civil society is a really important element of understanding the origins of social movements. But of course, because this is our discussion of collective action, we also know that collective action is really important in understanding social movements. A lot of the time, social movements, as I've mentioned, are trying to right some wrong. Some outrage has happened, some injustice in the world persists, and the public good here is often, greater equality in society, or the preservation or establishment of really important fundamental rights. And so these are often public goods, right? If I am part of a group that has been sort of systematically or legally discriminated against, of course, that would be amazing if the laws changed, and that's a public good, because whether or not I show up to the main square to protest, if the laws do change, I would also enjoy the fruits of that change. However, there are often a lot of incentives to free ride. Of course, there are always lots of incentives to free ride. And like always, it's the basic logic is that you might get the benefits regardless of whether you contribute. Again, if there's a social movement going on trying to bring about greater rights for a group that I belong to, well, that's great, but I'm going to get those rights. If the policy changes, I'm going to get that right, whether or not I actually show up and take part. And maybe I want to spend my Saturday doing something a little more relaxing than confronting the police in the main square of town. So this is a very standard element of the collective action problems and free rider problems that we've seen over and over again. Now, when it comes to a lot of social movements, not all social movements, but certainly many social movements, there's an additional wrinkle to this. And that is that the people participating in these social movements often face off against a major risk. They could have the risk of, being beaten, being arrested, having criminal records, spending time in jail, especially in autocratic settings, right? Of course, in an authoritarian regime, when you go out against the regime, you really might be risking a lot. In some regimes, you might just be risking a citation, but in others, you might be putting your entire career on the line. And so these risks actually increase the incentives to free ride, and this can be a really big problem. In an oppressive regime, there are lots and lots of reasons for people to want to overthrow the regime and get the public good of a better political regime with an establishment of basic protections and rights. However, because of the high risks of that, lots of people will pretend like they're happy with the regime to avoid punishment. So how do social movements ever come together? If the incentives to free ride, which are always pretty high, are even higher because of the risks associated with taking part in social movements, how do any of them ever come about? Well, in the first place, this can be an enjoyable experience. And if you've ever really stood up for something that you truly believed in and took part in that with other people and formed a community and had your voice heard, it feels really good. It feels really good to stand up for what's right and to build a community around that. Some people just, really, really will love taking part in these things, and so they are going to do so. And indeed, taking part in it can be a way to provide meaning in your life, and so it can be a very personally fulfilling thing to do. And so there are real incentives there, and there are some people who really like this. You might know a person who just likes to sort of protest and just like being against something, fighting the good fight is just part of his or her personality. So there are certainly those sort of rabble-rousers among us, which, rabble-rouser meaning being a good thing here in certain ways. But even for those of us who aren't maybe not as naturally predisposed to protest for protesting's sake, it can be a really important way of finding meaning. Uh, we have mentioned several times that these movements are often a reaction to contentious politics, to some outrage or grave injustice. And sometimes that is just so grave that it overrides the personal costs and even the personal risks. And so a lot of the time, these are a passionate, very visceral, emotional reaction because you are so outraged or angry, because you are so afraid of what would happen if the status quo persists, or because you're so hopeful that for once there's real change going on. But of course, these don't rely upon formal organizations, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing. It can be a bad thing because it's hard for them to articulate exact plans and even exact goals, but it can be a good thing because this loose organization means that they can spring up quickly, that they don't have lots of different actors and players to get into line before they can protest. This is a matter of just getting people together. And so we're seeing in the science of social movements lots of interesting thinking about how many people does it take to make a social movement. And when we know that the bigger the crowd is, the more likely people are to go to join, right? Because you're thinking, well, the risks of my participation are lower if I'm part of a bigger group, and the feeling of that this actually might get a real change is much stronger if there's a big group. So how do you get to that sort of critical mass of enough people protesting, enough people forming a social movement to attract other people who might be on the fence of an issue? And then, of course, how does technology affect all of this? 1989 happened before Facebook, before people really had cell phones. Of course, the American Revolution happened way back in a different era of communications. And now we're living in this sort of hyper-connected, globalized world. And does that affect social movements? Lots of people think that it's making them more and more common. So once again, we see that thinking through collective action is really critical to understanding a key variable here, social movements, that affect our political world in truly revolutionary ways, quite literally revolutionary ways. Once again, thank you for joining me. Have a wonderful day, and get in touch if you have any questions, concerns, or comments whatsoever.